Right. Ladies and gentlemen, shall we begin? This may be, this is as much silence as we're going to get. Welcome to this discussion on the Bretton Woods institutions and the climate crisis. My name is James Astill. I'm a Deputy Director in the IMF and delighted to welcome you to what is going to be a slightly different conversation, we hope. The conversations around you in this venue are about pressing, urgent short-term needs. We register those pressing, urgent, short-term needs, but this conversation is more about the long-term. What is the long-term future of the World Bank and the IMF in climate action, in the crisis and in the response? And this is a conversation that will be part of a broader set of conversations about the future of these institutions in what is the 80th year of their founding. And in just 1 second after I've introduced our esteemed panelists, I'll ask Mark Malloch Brown, who is a former Deputy Secretary General of the UN, to speak to us about that long-term commemorative ideating process about the future of these critically important institutions. But to our panelists, thank you for being with us, and I'm delighted to introduce you to Amal-Lee Amin, who is the Managing Director and Head of Climate, Diversity and Advisory at the UK's Development Finance arm, which is British International Investment. Amal-Lee is also a former Head of Climate at the Inter-American Development Bank. Besides her is Sir Andrew Steer, who is the CEO and President of the Bezos Earth Fund. Andrew is also a former head of the World Resource Institute, and before that, climate envoy of the World Bank. Welcome, Andrew. And besides Andrew is Helen Mountford. Helen is the president and CEO of ClimateWorks, one of the biggest climate action philanthropies, a platform for channeling and distributing climate philanthropic contributions. And Helen is also former head of economics and climate at WRI, Andrew's former shop. Welcome, Helen. Mark, would you like to kick us off richly?
Thank you, James, and thank you to the three panelists for joining you there, and to the audience as well. My greetings, and I'm sorry not to be with you in person. Just very quickly,
Mark, can I just, Mark, the sound is rather low. Can I just ask you to pause and see if we can raise it?
Sure.
Thank you, Mark. Let's have another go.
Okay. Well, I won't repeat the greetings and thanks to you all for being there. Let me just dive straight into the purpose of this project, of which this conversation is intended to be part. I and two others, Patrick Achi, former Prime Minister of Cote d'Ivoire, and Sri Mulyani Indrawati, the current Finance Minister of Indonesia, have been asked by the heads of the World Bank and the IMF, Ajay and Kristalina, to help through a series of conversations such as this to really understand what are the opportunities and challenges for the two institutions going forward. And of course, the expectations in the areas of climate finance are huge. The bank has been really the leading international public provider of concessionary finance for climate, and has made new commitments in that area in the last year. But the challenge, of course, is that enough? And all of you at the COP, the Finance COP as it's known, I think will have views and ideas on, is there more than the bank can do? Of course, for the bank's leadership, that cannot be at the expense of its parallel interrelated mission of development and poverty reduction. So how does it tackle both these ambitions with sufficient force and resource? And the second point I'd just make is that the IMF, beyond its crisis finance role, obviously has a critical surveillance role. It can help set the standard globally for what expectations are of climate resilient strategies in different countries, whether they are large-scale emitters or countries affected by large-scale emissions for both what is an appropriate climate strategy to ensure that they are at less risk of crisis than without. So, and for both institutions, there is a critical knowledge sharing role that goes beyond finance alone. So today we were interested in hearing both the views of the panelists, and I hope the audience, if there's time, around the financing challenges, but additionally those roles of knowledge sharing and surveillance as well. James, floor back to you.
Thanks very much indeed, Mark. It's a great kickoff. Andrew, let me bring you straight in with, I think, what is the meta question that we're all grappling with? What is the long-term role that these institutions need to play in the climate crisis?
Well, first, let me say, James, what an amazing thing it is that the IMF at a climate meeting is hosting a serious meeting about the future of international finance for climate. This is a genuinely positive sign, and I commend what you and Kristalina Georgieva and everybody is doing at the fund and also the bank. I mean, we are at a different stage than we were. I was at the original Rio Earth Summit working for the World Bank, and we had a booth, and the NGOs burned it down. They're not burning down the World Bank anymore. Most people believe the World Bank, for example, is a real source for good on climate change. And we've seen an incredible evolution in a very, very positive way. Let me talk about the bank, because I think probably you're going to say a word about the IMF. But the IMF, by the way, is making great progress, I believe. Climate risk is macro-critical. It's clear that the fund needs to keep building that capacity. In terms of the World Bank and all financial institutions, we're going through an inflection point. Up until now, the way that they would talk about climate change would be to say, well, we're putting in 100 million, we're putting in $1 billion, we're putting in 10 billion, 100 billion. I sat on the advisory board of Bank of America, and each advisory board, they were adding a few more zeros in terms of their commitment. And of course, that was really good for phase one. But phase two needs to be totally different. The issue is not whether you're doing 300 billion, it's what about the 3 trillion that you're actually lending. So one transition is you move away from thinking about dollars to thinking about impact. And that's something that that's work in progress. And I would recommend that Mark and the others sort of really think about that. But the main point I would want to make over the longer term is it's not just what the World Bank does, it's how the World Bank does it. If you want to solve climate change, whether that is hard-to-abate sectors in steel and airlines, or whether it's in nature-based solutions and how we're going to shift diets and so on, there are no silver bullets. No individual financial institution, no individual government will solve the problem. And there needs to be a pretty fundamental mindset change towards recognizing that it takes a portfolio of players to solve a problem. The World Bank, much as I admire it, is not very good at that yet. The World Bank loves partnerships, but its definition of a partnership is fine, we're in charge, and we will coordinate you, and ideally you'll channel your money through us. And the problem with that is that it doesn't actually get to the root of the problem. If you want JP Morgan, the Green Climate Fund, the Bezos Earth Fund, to follow the lead of governments around the World Bank has to be one player, ideally an important coordinating player, but not the only player. And it seems to me this is the most important transition that the World Bank needs to go through. There's a very interesting experiment going on at the moment. Well, it's not an experiment, it's a wonderful vision. It's called Mission 300. And it's the World Bank and the African Development Bank, and they are determined to bring clean electricity for the first time to 300 million Africans by 2030. and they're going to do things very differently. And the question is, how differently are they going to do it? And at the moment, they're doing a good job, but it's pretty much, well, we, the World Bank and the government will sort things out, we'll come up with a plan, then we'll ask you to come in. And the problem with that is over time, that's not going to work. And so the question is, why does everybody want to go to Davos every year as opposed to coming to the World Bank annual meetings? Is because Davos is the one place in the world where you can actually walk into a room and there's a head of state there, there are 3 CEOs there, there's a head of the leading university there, and you actually talk about a subject in a very frank way. That mindset needs to come in to the way the World Bank does it. What we need to do right now is have what we like to call a deal team for the planet. And the World Bank should be at the center of that, bringing the very best big program designers together and bringing in the heads of agencies, heads of state. One final thought from me that applies to the IMF as well as the World Bank. A short-term goal, but with long-term implications, we need to change the way we do economic modeling. And the World Bank needs to be central to that, as does the IMF. And Helen is the leader in this because she was head of the New Climate Economy. If you look at all of the treasury departments in the world, all the planning departments in the world, and if you were to say to them, tell you what, we're going to the government is announcing there are no internal combustion engine small vehicles to be sold after 2035, which a number of governments are saying. If you run those models, 95% of them will say, well, maybe it's a good idea, but it's going to hurt your economy. That is the economics of the 20th century. The economics of the 21st century says, actually, if you take everything into account, you'll actually find higher economic efficiency, you'll drive new technology, you will lower risk, and you will reshape expectations about the future. And those 4 things combined will actually drive a more exciting economy. And the World Bank, as it coordinates other players, needs to have that narrative, and we need to make a lot more progress on the way we do economics.
Thanks, Andrew. That's a lot and fascinating. Let me just say, to kind of bookend it, that out of Mark's project, which he's doing on behalf of the institutions, on behalf of Ajay Banga and Kristalina Georgieva, I think it's fair to say, Mark, that you're sort of settling on key principles that the institutions need to husband and reinforce over the decades. We've talked about credibility, authority, legitimacy, and listening to you, I would add flexibility and even humility to that list, both of which are hard things for big bureaucracies to master. But I very much take your point. Let's just stick with MDBs before we turn to the fund, Helen. Amal-Lee, you're a former leader in one. What would you add to Andrew's great start?
Yeah, thank you. Is that, you can hear me? Yeah. No, and I think everything Andrew said, totally resonates. Having worked in a regional development bank, not in the World Bank, but worked very closely with the World Bank, both at the sort of institutional level, but also critically at the country level, when thinking about how to deliver programs that were going to have a more systemic impact. This was through the climate investment funds that Andrew and I both actually also helped design from the UK government side originally as well. And the role of those in driving transformational impact. And it wasn't just the concessional funding on the table, that was really important, but it was the fact that as MDBs we had to come together, we spoke to the government jointly, we came up with a program that talked about transformation. This was back in 2009, 10, and we were talking about transforming sectors. We were trying to get away from thinking project by project. But I think, whilst I think we had some success, we are still not yet thinking about system-wide impact, system-wide change. And I fully agree with Andrew's point that we also, as we start to think more about the trillions, we have to also start thinking about success beyond just pure dollars in terms of how the MDBs are getting dollars out the door, but rather what is the impact in terms of the catalytic impact, as well as other measures of impact as well. I possibly would be so bold as to say that the focus on pure dollars out the door can actually disincentivize some innovation that is really needed to deliver very transformational impact, because it leads to time pressures, it leads to focusing on doing the easiest thing that's going to get through your credit committee, get through your board in the time available, because you're focused on dollars out the door. But that's, I'll put that aside. But so getting the right incentives internally and ensuring that that's focused on delivering what I would say, we need a whole of economy change at the country level. We need, what that means is a whole of multilateral development bank approach and collaboration across all sectors. When I was at IDB, that was very much the area of focus that we really prioritize, working with our fiscal division, with our social divisions, with our the divisions that were working on helping ministries of finance think about their how they integrate risk, climate risk, as well as opportunity into their macroeconomic thinking, as well as their sort of more micro economic policies. And really doing that, I know Helen will talk about the fund, and the role of central banks is going to be critical, the Network for Greening the Financial System has done some really fantastic work. Just need to get on and integrate it, mainstream it, implement it. And then finally, this whole of system-wide approach where the MDBs work effectively with other counterparties. I'm from a DFI, we're an impact investor, and how we collectively bring our areas of comparative advantage to bear. And I think, Andrew's point about maybe you have a deal team for the planet that can help facilitate that. I know there's been a lot of focus on country platforms, and I think country platforms can mean different things to different people as well, but certainly something that helps facilitate that whole of system approach at the country level, at the sector level, is absolutely critical at this point.
Thanks very much indeed, Amal-Lee. Yeah. System change, system-wide change is just so much the right way to think about the challenge, right? And it also presents an interesting conundrum for the bank and fund. Mark's project is sort of about reflecting on 80 years of strength, and that leads to an instinct to preserve what's good about the institutions as well as to reform and reach to the future. So preservation and reform, I think, can sometimes be in tension, slow each other down to a degree. Helen, again, what is the long-term role that these institutions, let's say the fund, should play in the climate crisis? Thank you.
Thanks very much, James. Wonderful to be here and completely agree absolutely with all that Andrew and Amal-Lee have said. From the perspective of the IMF, I think there's some really critical roles that it currently plays, but aren't not quite stepping up to the plate on what we need for climate finance. And we know that going forward, we're here in Baku, people are negotiating the new finance goal. We're going to need a lot of the climate finance flows coming through the MDBs or through the IMF and leveraging private finance. We know that's going to need to happen. So the roles going forward are going to be critical. I think one of the things we see with IMF is that Kristalina Georgieva has an incredible vision and has been very clear about how the climate crisis is macro-critical. And to be honest, we're seeing this, each of us, we're seeing it, we're feeling it day to day around the world. The impacts of climate change are enormous. We see this in the most vulnerable countries, of course, and we have small islands who get battered year after year with tropical storms, wiping out their GDP, having to rebuild and move again. In the US, recently we had the hurricanes Helen and Hurricane Milton. Milton looked like it was going to hit as a Category 5 storm. And 2 or 3 states in the US would have had enormous damage, would have been a test for our whole insurance system. right? So would that work? So we know that it is macro critical, and the IMF is doing some really important work integrating this into the discussions and the work it's having with countries, the surveillance systems, the convenings, but it could do more. I think at the moment it's sort of touching on it, but not yet really using those leverage points that the IMF has with countries to really, the convening, bringing together the finance ministries to tackle common challenges, and then the surveillance mechanisms that it has. So let me give you a couple of examples within these. In terms of the convening, one of the big challenges we know is those countries that are being hit time and time again by climate impacts, floods, drought, heat waves, storms, get hit, have to borrow money to rebuild, even as they're rebuilding and paying off the debt, get hit again, and then go further and further spiraling into indebtedness. Now, in many cases, those countries are not the ones that were responsible for climate change, which has led to this situation, but it's a spiraling problem. There's a lot that the IMF is trying to do and can do more of, and Amal-Lee from Barbados has really been championing what that could look like in terms of the IMF's tools. But I would say that the IMF's convening power here is also important. How do we get finance ministers around the world to recognize this as the challenge it is? Those who hold the debt in many cases with these countries, to actually work together and find a different approach so we don't have this spiraling indebtedness and debt servicing. How do we actually move beyond that? We've had some negotiations country by country. They're painful, difficult, don't lead to a lot. We can't keep doing that. The world is going to get more and more impacted by climate change. So we need a completely different approach, and IMF convening could really try and launch that. A second area is the work, for example, in the Coalition of Finance Ministers for Climate Action and IMF and World Bank Group. One of the issues that's come up many times is fossil fuel subsidies, and IMF has been collecting data on these, shows that the subsidies plus the non-internalized costs of climate action, like the impacts on our health, our well-being, that adds to something like $7 trillion per year. If you just look at the direct subsidies to fossil fuels and the tax breaks to fossil fuels, OECD and IEA have a combined number, just the subsidies and tax breaks. It's $1.4 trillion last year. $1.4 trillion supporting fossil fuels. If you compare that to climate policy initiatives, latest numbers on all climate finance out there, public, private, philanthropic, domestic, international, that was $1.5 trillion. We have the data, we have the information, we know how to do subsidy reform. We can't continue this way. So that is one, the fossil fuel subsidies, how to really make the breakthroughs and get progress on that with the countries working with IMF. Those are things through the convening, through the work of IMF with countries can make progress. On the surveillance, again, I think there's been some really important efforts and progress in the IMF to bring in the macro-critical climate impacts to some of the surveillance, the Article 4 reviews and consultations of countries that are particularly climate vulnerable. That's important. But we need to go beyond that. And we need to look at what does this actually mean for fossil fuel producing and exporting countries. And I think IMF is not there yet. And it gets to Andrew's point on the modeling. A lot of the models, a lot of the analysis basically assume that if you're producing oil and gas, you're going to get $100 per barrel forevermore. There's going to be no disruption. It's not going to switch away from demand. Now, even from the last 10 years, we know that's not true. We have price fluctuations which throw the countries dependent on oil and gas revenues into economic chaos. We know and we're seeing this incredible exponential uptake of electric vehicles and renewable energy, now cheaper than fossil fuel energy, and that is going to shift the demand. So you're not going to have demand unending. But that's not reflected in those reviews or in the discussions with those countries. Instead, often those countries are encouraged to do more fossil fuel exploration and development to help pay off the balance of payments. So if they're encouraged to do that, at the same time as IEA says there is no space, no need for further exploration and development of oil and gas, we're going in the wrong direction. And so I think those are a couple of areas where IMF standing up even further to really embed this macro-critical aspect of the risks of climate action, the risks of continuing on a business as usual path in their modeling, in their surveillance, in their discussions with countries, would be such a move away from where we are now potentially. But we need them to do more.
Thank you very much indeed for that, Helen. Look, it's completely fascinating to me that none of the three of you has mentioned dollars as being the main contribution of these institutions, which is fascinating, partly because their dollar contribution is so well advertised. The fund is set up from a standing start, $48 billion climate and resilience trust. The bank, I think, put through the door $43 billion in climate financing last year. So they're big dogs in the climate financing world, but they also do so many other things. And I think that certainly we at the fund would really sympathize with your analysis, Helen, that the surveillance may be more critically important, helping governments run their economies, than the money that we put out in crisis lending. Andrew, we talked about system-wide change. It's a phrase of Amal-Lee's. I think you'd like to fly even higher than we've flown so far and look at the collective institutions that the Bretton Woods are embedded in, the UN system, and the fitness of that system to tackle this existential problem. Go for it.
Well, it's not so much I'd like to fly higher, it's that I think we probably should, though.
We must.
And for Mark, I mean, if you're talking about the next 80 years, I mean, we do need to ask some big questions. Are we set up in terms of the overall architecture in the optimal way? And I think if everyone in this room were to sit down and say, assume there are no institutions at all, financial institutions or monetary or accountability or negotiating institutions, how would you design it? My guess is we would not design it the way it is now. And so I do think, someone at some stage needs to be taking that longer-term view. It was interesting that is it called the Pact for the Future that was presented at the climate at UNGA this year. It talked very, very frankly about the need to reform the UN system, the need to change the Security Council, the need to get rid of the veto, and so on. Now, that may never happen, but at least I think it needs to be put on the table. And we do need to remember that one of the reasons that the World Bank and the IMF have not been as popular as they should be is because of a voting structure and a governance structure that is perceived not to be very equal. At the same time, UN agencies, which might be one country, one vote, also doesn't seem intuitively to be the optimal way either. So I do think that we need to think about that. But coming back to assuming there's no possibility, I mean, what would be ideal is if there could be some, not takeovers, but mergers that we should be thinking about. You think about, the expertise that they're building up in Songdo on the climate, Green Climate Fund, and in the 8 UN agencies that are working on climate change. Think about all those. Do we really think all those skill bases are efficiently shared? Do we think that transactions costs among the different players are low? No, they're very high, and we need to be thinking about that if we really believe that we face an existential crisis, which we do with climate change. I mean, there really is the possibility that everything that the World Bank and IMF have been trying to do could be undermined in a very profound way. Just sort of building on that, I mean, one of the transitions, it seems to me, that the World Bank and the system as a whole needs to go through is to complement the country-by-country approach and the project-by-project approach with an approach that is much broader, a kind of movement approach, an approach that's going to solve big global problems. So, Mark, I hope you do a sort of review of the history, but I'm sure if you do, you'll talk about how, President McNamara for the World Bank stood up to his knees in mud in Surabaya, and he said the way we've been doing development of the World Bank is all wrong. It's not just about ports and roads and bridges and factories. It's about poor people. And there was a radical shift then towards what was called basic needs and a truly radical change towards poverty. And also you think about sort of what was done in agriculture, what the World Bank did in helping to create CGIR and help really bring about and drive the green revolution. That wasn't, yes, it was a country-by-country approach, but it was much bigger than that. You think about sort of major crises like river blindness. The World Bank, you know, took that on with others and solved the problem once and for all. Now, today, if you look about the challenges in climate change, you know, we've got to massively invest in battery storage. Who is really leading at the world level? Who's pulling people together? Yes, there are battery groups. You go to Davos, you'll find all kinds of groups. But what about and the Global Energy Alliance for People and Planet? But what we need is a system to say, right, that is a big issue. What about transmission in Africa? Huge, huge problem. You know, go to DRC. I mean, 80 million people don't have electricity. The grid almost doesn't exist. Who is pulling together heads of institutions in a way that would change that? That's the role that the World Bank, the Bretton Woods, and the system as a whole needs to play. When you know, the Ukraine war began, within a week, you know, you had heads of government meeting. When COVID started, not quite as good, but there was an incredible sort of focus. Where's the focus today? And we've room for improvement. And this is it's not going to happen overnight, and it requires that mindset change, which is so important.
Thanks for that, Andrew. Mark, can I ask you to come in on this? You know, speaking for the fund, I can speak for the bank too. Both institutions have profoundly changed the way they think about climate change and climate action, and have produced a host of really significant, impactful new initiatives, but they don't meet the bar that Andrew has set of radical transformation. I wonder how you think about that balance between incrementalism, which is what the institutions can do, and a far more transformational kind of change of the kind that Andrew outlines. Excuse us, Mark, we just need to get the sound back. Are we there? Mark, could you try? No, I'm sorry, we don't have volume. I'm so sorry, Mark. Hang on, Mark, we're just... Can we have the volume, Angela? Okay, Mark, we'll come back. We'll come back.
I think he was going to disagree with us anyway, so it's probably a good thing.
Andrew, Mark is very much putting words in your mouth. I mean, you want to shake your head if you disagree with Andrew's proposition. No, you'll have something much more sophisticated to respond to than that. Mark, well, okay, Angela, can you let me know when the volume is back? Look, we have so much ground that we could cover, but we've got limited time. Let me just try and reframe the question in a slightly different way. The bank and the fund are still the main torchbearers, or very much at the forefront of international cooperation, functioning parts of an international system that has been tested in recent years. And the fund has done a lot of work on geo-economic fragmentation to support that. Helen, let me put this delicate geopolitical question to you. There was a great hope, I think it still exists, that there could be a little bit of a carve-out for climate at a world where big countries don't get along as they once did, find it harder to cooperate. But maybe working through these institutions, there could still be a good measure of cooperation on climate. Do you see that hope, surviving, especially given the kinds of climate policies, industrial policies, associated protectionism that countries are adopting on climate action?
That's an excellent question. I think we have been pushing on the boundaries of cooperation on climate here and elsewhere, and it's challenging, particularly when it comes to issues like finance flows and support for others. So that is something where we have been facing challenges, and as we go into a period where we're likely to see ODA decrease, public finance decrease, the importance of really leveraging private finance, trade flows, investments is going to be so critical. And I think one of the things that we're seeing is that there's no longer any question about whether there's a trade-off between development and climate or economic growth and climate action. You actually need to, climate action, not climate, sorry. There's definitely a trade-off between climate impacts and they destroy development, they destroy and can wipe out economic growth. So we need to, and we can have economic growth, development, achieve all sorts of social and economic benefits for individuals, for communities, for society, and also have climate action. And I would say that we can't actually have either the development side or the climate action side without the other one. They need to go hand in hand together. So I think what we're seeing is more of the self-interest, I would say, from countries, the opportunities of taking a strong, ambitious climate action approach. And we have a number of countries where we've seen this happen and starting to move much more into green industrial policies in the U.S. And we won't talk about recent happenings in the U.S., but in the U.S., the climate policy of the last few years that got bipartisan support and is being implemented now across the U.S. is one that is very much about how to get action on the ground, how to benefit households with lower electricity prices, help to move clean energy forward in ways where it really benefits communities and households, delivers jobs, etc. You look at China. China last year, 1/3 of their GDP growth is attributable to clean energy developments. Electric vehicles, solar and wind power, and batteries. You look at other countries, they're starting to put in place a lot of green industrial policies following this trend in many other countries. I was just in Jakarta last month, I think it was, you were there as well, in September. And one of the things that they've been doing is they're keen to move forward on electric vehicle manufacturing. Because, of course, they've got these incredible transition minerals within Indonesia, and they don't want to just export the transition minerals. They want to get the manufacturing domestically, but they don't have necessarily the companies there who will do that. And so they've done deals with companies like BYD and a number of other car manufacturers and said, if you build manufacturing capacity here in Indonesia, you can sell your cars here. And then we can use our transition minerals and we can move up the value chain and develop our own green industries, be competitive in these areas. It means jobs, it means opportunities, it means growth opportunities. People are seeing this as the growth opportunities of the future. So I think that's something which we're starting to see is, at the moment there's a lot of tensions. Everyone's saying, well, who can get there first? How can you do it? But actually this is going to be an enormous opportunity for the world as we shift from fossil fuels to clean energy, to electric vehicles, to public transport. It's enormous. And so the more there can be some cooperation along these lines, I'd call it cooperation, co-opetition, right? Cooperation and some competition. But in many cases, you're going to need a whole supply chain working together. And so how do you do some of those partnerships? BYD in Indonesia, that's a sort of Chinese-Indonesian approach, working together. There's others that are going on. So how do you actually focus on some of those, see where the value add is in each country, the comparative advantage, and how you can work together to ensure smooth flows of minerals or traded goods in ways that are socially and environmentally responsible, because that's what your trade partners are going to require. So you can actually bring that into it and help improve opportunities in different countries. So to me, that's an area which at the moment it's not yet clear. It'll be a one of cooperation, but there's real potential there for a different approach internationally.
Let me maybe unfairly force you to a judgment then.
Okay.
Is this growing combination of industrial policy and protectionism, is it accelerating our global progress, or is it collectively slowing us down?
That's a hard one to judge. I would say, I think, on some of the green industrial policies, and particularly where you combine it, and this is, again, something which IMF and World Bank can really help countries to do, where you combine that with your own fiscal policies, your finance systems that make it work, I think that is definitely making progress. I think some of the protectionism is a knee-jerk reaction, which is actually harming probably economic growth as well as climate action. But having approaches where you can really move forward on some of these policies, but recognize that we are codependent across countries. Very few countries can do it all fully themselves, and in fact, as you look across all that you need to produce, you can't do that. So recognizing codependencies and building on those rather than trying to reject them, I think would lead to a lot faster progress.
Thank you for that, Helen. Mark, with apologies for our failure before, I think we have you back. Would you like to?
Yes. Okay, well, look, a fascinating discussion. I mean, certain things come out at me.
More volume? Sorry, Mark. Yeah.
Certain things come out at me very, very strongly. I mean, first, is this issue of the economic model. Andrew described it as a 20th century model. It's one which, for both institutions, still fails to properly incorporate the expansion of an economy and its resilience that comes from these kinds of investments. Instead, it's still a shot in time which records these investments as a cost on the economy rather than the expansion of the economy. And I think this is a fundamental shift in how we understand the link between climate and economics and future resilience that has to be made, and where these two institutions can be real thought leaders. I mean, these ideas are alive in universities, they're alive in think tanks. You've just heard Helen articulate them as well as Andrew. But the question is, these two institutions can give them mainstream weight, if you like. And I think, similarly along the same point, the economic models of the two institutions are in some ways still stranded on some of the neoliberal redoubts of the past and do not incorporate the kind of pragmatic advice that Helen was just commenting on, where, there is going to be a role for industrial policy, there is going to be a role for national champions, but it needs to be balanced against not falling into a uncontrolled protectionism, which, as the IMF reported at the last annual meetings, would drag all ships down, which would lower economic growth around the world. I think secondly, on partnerships, again, critical points were made that the bank and the fund, particularly the bank, can't anymore assume it's the leader and others follow. There is, as we heard from all the panelists, a whole new model of partnership necessary, particularly if you want to draw in the private sector, etc. But I think there's also a lot of romanticism around the private sector expectations. It's not necessarily at a project by project level always. It's systems levels, and it's through potentially tools like securitization of World Bank and other MDB lending to sort of sell it on to private sector pension funds, etc., to free resources for fresh lending, rather than expecting the private sector to always be in there on a small project by project basis where they don't have the expertise or the overhead possibly to be able to do it in the way that the bank can do it. And I think we then heard really important points about the IMF's non-financial role, the surveillance role, if you like, and its ability to shift the goalposts in terms of government and private sector investment priorities in very real ways. So this was an extremely useful discussion for me. I've taken notes because I could hear it all, even if you couldn't always hear me. So I was the listener I wanted to be in that sense. And so really wanted to thank you all for the power of the comments at this stage. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mark. Look, I hope to be able to come to you, the audience. We're out of time, unfortunately, but many of us from the fund and the bank are going to be here. Come to us, raise your points, give us your advice. We'd like to hear from you over the next few days. We are out of time, but let's just go down the line. If you just want to take one point from your own submissions or one of your fellow panelists or something we haven't discussed, what's the one thing that you would emphasize you'd like to see these institutions or one of them do to equip themselves for this future world, this daunting future climate world? Just very, very briefly. Amal-Lee.
So one thing that, hello? Yeah, just building on what was just said, and I think the role of the IMF in particular, but also the World Bank and the system, thinking through what does resilience really mean in this next century, and what is the role of the public sector, which may be governments, municipals, maybe the multilateral banks, and what is the role of the private sector? We need to rethink that model, and we need to ensure risk is best managed where it can be most effectively managed in the private sector. That will mean some rewards associated with that. But that doesn't mean that government is going to be the one. Governments cannot be the ones who bear the brunt of the climate crisis over time. So I think we just need to rethink that. I don't have the solution, but I know there's a need for that quite urgently.
No doubt. Thank you very much indeed, Amal-Lee, and thank you for your earlier submission too. Andrew.
Well, first, thanks for the discussion. I think Ajay Banga and Kristalina Georgieva are doing very good jobs. My advice to them would simply be, gather your staff together and tell them, in whatever sector they're working in, to think about 2050 and what's the world they would like. And do not be constrained with the Monday to Friday work rules that you have today. Don't be constrained with the policies you have or the timelines you have. Think bigger. Think about a movement that you could create and who do you have to do it with. And get out there and be bold. And then they should reintroduce the idea of, okay, how many people work for the World Bank? 20,000, right? 1,000 of them every year switch with the private sector. I bet you'd find some financial institutions that would love to do that switch. And maybe another 500 switch with governments, our client governments. See what that's like and get that kind of, my goodness me, we need to see things through other people's eyes, especially our clients, of course.
Great. Thank you, Andrew. Helen.
I'm going to take a slightly more prosaic one, but I think it would lead to enormous shifts within the IMF, which is really rethinking the economic analysis, modeling the surveillance on fossil fuel development, exploration, and exports. At the moment, it's still being treated as something that benefits the economies that are doing this. It is not being seen in the broader picture of we cannot afford this anymore. It cannot continue this way. And so I think a rethink of all of that would be an enormous benefit to the world.
Thank you, Helen. Thank you all for being here. Please join me in thanking our panelists, Amal-Lee Amin, Andrew Sear, Helen Mountford, and Mark. Thank you.